This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update with Lee Schulz, the chief economist for Ever.Ag's livestock division, starts today's show. Lee talks about cattle on feed, cold storage, and replacement heifer prices. Matt Sittel, assistant state climatologist at K-State, keeps the show rolling with a review of Kansas's weather in 2024. He explains how this year's weather compares to previous years. K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts ends the show by discussing that people could be seeing dead waterfowl because of avian influenza, and he says how people should handle those situations. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update with the chief economist for the livestock division at Ever.Ag, Lee Schulz. Lee, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me again.
Lee, looking at the cattle market, what are we seeing?
I think as you look at trade last week, it was maybe a bit of a tale of two stories. Futures were lower. I wouldn't point to any fundamental factors really driving that. I think you had the Fed announcing that they're looking to, pause lowering interest rates, or at least have fewer of the lower interest rates in 2025, which caused weakness in equity markets. You have a strong U.S. dollar. I think you had some technical pressure, really just overall pushed live cattle and feeder cattle futures lower, off some highs we've seen in recent weeks. And so, I wouldn't expect, from a fundamental standpoint for that to continue that pressure. Why I say that, when you look at it from a cash standpoint, we were at worst steady with the prior week, and at best, I think a few dollars higher, especially when you look at the dress market here in the north. So I think, some overall technical pressure on our markets, but not anything that's notably pushing markets lower. I think you further look at a box beef trade that, compared to historical levels, remains record high. I think, you're seeing a bit of seasonal pressure here as you're getting in late into the year. We know that Q1 is seasonally weaker than Q4, and that's what we're making a lot of purchases for right now when you look at that box beef trade. But if you look at Friday to Friday, we traded right at that 316 range. If you look overall, kind of the average for the week, you could even argue there was a bit of an uptone this last week, because, we traded much higher earlier in the week, and we were at Thursday at 320.69, and then kind of had a big decline, 442, as we got into Friday. So, I'd argue we're kind of steady from a box beef standpoint, and that really matches with our slaughter levels, being relatively consistent with year-ago levels.
And Lee, report that's also come out on December 20th, cattle on feed.
This will be the last cattle on feed report for the year. And, I think as we look at pre-report expectations, overall, I think expected cattle on feed inventories to be pretty close to a year ago levels, placements to be smaller than a year ago levels, and marketings to be a bit smaller. Now, reason why driving some of those placements and marketings is we did have one less slaughter day in November 2024 compared to November 2023. It was one less Wednesday. We did have an additional Saturday. So you kind of have to make those adjustments for that when you think of those levels. Actual numbers came in real close to pre-report expectations. So we were down 0.3% in cattle on feed. We were down 3.7 when you look at placement numbers, and down 1.5 as far as marketings. So as far as a market reactions, being so close to pre-report expectations, I don't expect to see any real reactions Monday from this report. Now, if you look at the report from a standpoint of placements, a few more placements, you could argue, well, maybe it's a little bit bearish, but again, so close to pre-report expectations, not so much. much. And then we had a few fewer cattle on feed numbers. So overall, I'd kind of consider this a neutral report as far as when we look at it from a national standpoint. Y'all note in Iowa, we did really see about 3% more cattle on feed in large feedlots, small feedlots, which we have a small feedlot survey here in Iowa that accompanies this cattle on feed report. Same there. And we actually seen quite a few placements in smaller feedlots. So I think there is some incentive to place cattle on feed with lower grain prices to walk that corn off the farm. And you're starting to see that real uptick in some of those placements because of that. Some positive margins as you look into 2025.
So even as pre-report expectations were really similar to what the report was, pretty just normal for what we're seeing when we have a December cattle on feed report?
Yeah, I think, as we look at a lot of the data that we get prior to this report, I think that was, what analysts were viewing here. And this report didn't really contradict any of that data. We look at November placement figure was actually the smallest since 2015, comparable to 2014 levels. As you think that was really tight supplies, the last time we seen, the tightness in supplies. But you got to take those into context. We've had a huge placement number in October. And so that you have to kind of look at over a couple month period. Analysts did that. You see where analysts were at compared to actual numbers. So again, yeah, I think it's, kind of we see seasonally where these numbers are and where the analysts had them as well.
And when we're thinking about reports, wanting to mention some reports that are coming out Monday, December 23rd, cold storage and hogs and pigs.
Yeah, so both of these reports, I think are certainly relevant for the cattle industry. I think, a little bit difference in what they're telling us. So if we look at the cold storage report, this is inventories that are in cold storage as of the end of the month. So the data will be as of the end of November. And for the beef industry, that we're provided boneless product and cuts. And you can think about this as a lot of this product is from a boneless standpoint would be imports. That would be a lean product that would be ground with our fat trimmings to supply our ground beef product. A lot of the cuts would be products that are being staged for export. And as we look at the end of October, so the last report, you've seen boneless product was actually down 4.2% compared to year ago levels. Cuts were up 7.3%. Total, we were down about 3.1% because there's a lot more boneless than cut products that are in cold storage. I use this cold storage as kind of a barometer of movement of product, and especially kind of when you think about, how strong demand has been. I think that's an indication that, we've not really seen that boneless product go to cold storage because it's going straight to, our retail and food service and end users. And so you haven't seen it build up there. From a cuts, we did see it a bit higher. But when I look at exports, exports for beef were down by volume about 1.9% year to date. But we have a lot of outstanding sales. So about 26% increase that's on the books that's kind of yet to be shipped. And so, I think any product that is being staged for export is certainly gonna be shipped. And when you think about where we're at from a price standpoint and production standpoint, to see exports even estimated roughly up for the year potentially, that's a very bullish figure, right? As we're sending just as much or more product at higher prices. And so that's certainly contributed to the stronger demand we've seen so far here in 2024. Hogs and pigs report, this is obviously, we'll think about it from a cattle market standpoint as a substitute, right? For beef as one of those competitors, and you think about pork. And so we kind of look at that from, where those supplies are going to be at and how that's likely going to impact prices. I think it's a real quick one to highlight here is a lot of expectation that we're going to see similar inventories in 2025 as we did in 2024 for the pork industry. And so what that means from a price standpoint is, supplies will not be overall, pressuring or pushing prices higher. I think, we're going to see any price direction from a pork standpoint really be driven by demand as opposed to from a supply standpoint that are, by and large expected to be pretty close to year ago levels.
And something, Lee, you also want to mention, and important for us to talk about for cattle producers, they might want to consider looking into replacement heifers.
So this was an article I wrote recently, just highlighting, I think when you look at some recent sales and just kind of looking at some USDA data that's available, I see some replacement heifer prices with a range of maybe 2,500 to a low to possibly 4,500 for a high, kind of in that 3,000 to 3,500 range. That looks pretty reasonable to me. And why I'm, have some confidence in saying that is if you use a tool we have on the Ag Decision Maker website at Iowa State University of net present value of beef replacement females, and use a bunch of assumptions, so some forecasts of prices over the next 8 calving opportunities and some cow costs, use interest rates, use expected weaning weights, you get a maximum bid price right in that range of, I would argue about $3,400. And so, and with some more bullish assumptions, I think you can even get up to the $4,500 per head range that was kind of the top end of some recent sales. And so, why I say that is if we look at the last expansionary phase of the cattle cycle, we really seen replacement heifer prices really escalate rather quickly because there was a lot of incentive to expand. Calf prices were escalating and profits were really large. And so, I think right now is an opportunity where they're, I think, very fairly priced. And as we think about the next couple of years, and I think expansion is still a couple of years off, we're going to continue to bid up those replacement heifer prices. And you may be thinking in a year or two, it would have been nice to start growing my herd the year before, right, when there was some pretty reasonable prices. Now, that's all going to come down to, do I have the resources, feed and other resources, labor, to be able to do that, to maybe hold back a few more heifers or buy a few more replacement heifers this year.
Lee, I appreciate you taking the time to give us our cattle market update today.
Well, I wish everyone a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year and a very prosperous 2025 for the cattle market.
That was the chief economist for the livestock division at Ever.Ag, Lee Schulz. I will link the resources that he talked about in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show recapping the weather in 2024 with Assistant State Climatologist with K-State, Matt Sittel. Matt, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Shelby. Thanks for having me.
Matt, talking through a few of the different aspects of weather and starting off with temperature, and what did the temperature overall look like for 2024?
I think one of the biggest stories of 2024 is something that maybe most people don't realize has happened. So far, for the first 11 months of 2024, this is the 4th warmest year on record. And when we talk about records, the folks that track records, the National Centers for Environmental Information, have 130 years of data going back to 1895. And so when we look at 2024, with respect to those other 129 years that precede it, we're currently ranked as the 4th warmest year on record. It may not sound like much because the departure from normal is 2.3 degrees above normal. And you think, well, 2 degrees a day doesn't sound like a whole lot. And of course, when the weather varies, we've had some very warm periods and some low periods. In fact, if we counted every day that's been above normal this year, 64% of our days this year have been above normal. And that's based on an average of all the data we have in the state.
Have all the months of 2024 been above average?
Not all of them. January, and of course we're now going back quite a ways, there was a period in mid-January where we were bitterly cold. I think folks may remember, like here in Manhattan, we dropped to 13 below zero. And so January was one of our months, and then the other one was July. All of the other 9 months have been above normal, and we are getting into the second half of December, and so far in December, we're also running above normal.
And as we do look at this data, looking at from December 17th to beforehand, and
Correct.
What could make it maybe be an even warmer year than what we're seeing right now?
Yes, if we stay where we are right now in terms of being above normal, we're going to finish as the 3rd warmest year. We're really not too far away from perhaps notching the 2nd warmest year on record. We'll have to see what happens here in the next 10 or 14 days through the remainder of December. Right now, the outlooks favor much above normal temperatures through the end of the year. So we might actually finish as the 2nd warmest. We'll not get the 1st warmest. We would have to be 5 degrees higher than the warmest December on record to pull that off. And we're not going to be that warm, unfortunately.
have we been also then really lacking on how cold it has been in the past?
That's true. If we look all across the state, the coldest temperature that we have seen anywhere in the state for the fall into early winter is just 9 degrees. And that happened in Tribune at our Mesonet site 6 miles northeast of town in Greeley County. We haven't had any temperatures in the state colder than that. Normally by this time of year, places like Goodland should have had at least 4 days where they had low temperatures in the single digits or even colder. They haven't had any this year. Goodland's only dropped to 13 degrees so far for their coldest temperature, which is it's very unusual because their normal lows now are in the upper teens. So if the coldest you've been is only 4 degrees below your normal, you've obviously been very warm.
And another aspect of weather that farmers and ranchers usually really care about, precipitation, and how has that averaged out over the year?
Precipitation has largely been below normal. If we look at the current picture across the state through mid-December, roughly 60% of the state is below normal for the year. However, November was the game changer. We were at our worst position for drought in the state at the end of October. And November came along, ended up being the second wettest November on record, again for that 130-year period that we talked about for temperature. And only one year, 1909, was the wettest year on record. We came within about a quarter inch of breaking that record and being the wettest November on record. Even though we didn't, at least 30 locations in the state had their wettest November on record, including some of our climate records that go back over 100 years, like Wichita and Dodge City and Goodland. All three of those had their wettest November on record. We even had in one of our counties, we had 10.55 inches in Montgomery County. The last time anywhere in the state of Kansas had more than 10 inches of precipitation in November was 1998. So really unusual. We don't expect 10 inches of precipitation in November. Maybe in June, but even in June, it's unusual to get that much. So November was really unusual. And as a result, we had parts of the state that improved by 2 or even 3 drought categories. And we've now got a third of the state that is currently drought-free, which is wonderful news for the state.
And as we're thinking about precipitation, also important to mention what snow we've had.
Well, there really hasn't been a whole lot of snow to talk about. I was looking at some numbers, and Goodland has had only 3.5 inches of snow since the beginning of fall. And it's important to say it was in the fall because it fell in early November. There's been no snow at all in December so far in Goodland. It's not unprecedented. I believe it's happened 4 times that Goodland did not get any snow in the month of December. I'm not going to say it could be the 5th one. It's possible. We'll have to see what happens here because we've still got a number of days left in the month. But all locations in the state are running below normal for snowfall right now. The only one that's even close to normal is Topeka, which is a little bit unusual. They had a 3-inch snow event not too long ago, which is about where normal is. Wichita, a trace. That's all they've had. So it's been unusual. And December has been below normal so far for precipitation, but December is not one of our wetter months anyway. We only average about an inch of precipitation. So going 2 or 3 weeks without precipitation, it's not unprecedented. It's certainly not a good thing. We would like to, of course, have some precipitation as we go through the winter months, but right now it's been pretty dry.
What parts of the state have been the wettest and the driest for 2024?
Well, the one area that has far and away been the wettest is southwest Kansas. Southwest Kansas right now will not set the record for their wettest year on record, but they certainly set the record for their wettest November. As we mentioned earlier, Dodge City was one of those locations that had their wettest November on record. Southwest Kansas had a number of precipitation events, very unusual for them. Driest part of the state is north central Kansas. That even though there was some precipitation, there was 1.5 inches of rain in Concordia here not too long ago. But in general, as I say, 60% of the state is below normal still, not much below. The average for the year is running about 1 inch below normal. So it's generally pretty good conditions for most of the state. And again, hopefully that will continue into the new year.
And as we talked about precipitation, you mentioned drought, Matt. And what is the index and kind of how is it measured when we look at Kansas as a whole?
The easiest way I like to look at drought conditions is something called the Drought Severity and Coverage Index. It's generated by the folks at the U.S. Drought Monitor who come up with those categories every week. Simply all it does is it looks at everywhere in the state and says, well, what percent of the state is drought free? What percent of the state is in D0, D1, all the way through D4? So, for example, if the whole state were drought free, that index would be 0. Now, if the whole state were in D4, which is the most severe drought category, then that DSCI would be 500. So it's basically an average of the category across the state. And right now, we're at 96, which means on average, the state is roughly in D0. That's not, of course, the case because, as we said, 33% of the state is running below normal. But you go back 4 weeks ago to the end of October, we were at 211. That month of November that was so wet, on average, improved the state by one drought category. So it was wonderful news, beneficial rains. It happened over an extended period of time, which allowed it to soak into the ground. So just November was great. It was wonderful for people, and I hope that that trend continues.
Where do we see the greatest gain in drought category improvement?
Far southeast Kansas, especially along the Oklahoma as well as the Missouri border. In fact, Oklahoma, where we had the second wettest November on record, Oklahoma had their wettest November on record. There were some places in the Tulsa area that got over 13 inches of rain for the month of November. But anywhere that was close to Oklahoma, also far southeast Kansas, they had the best improvements. In fact, nowhere in the state had worsening conditions during November. Everywhere was either the same category or 1, 2, or 3 category improvement. So wonderful news.
Finally, all of Kansas has been out of D2 drought now in 2024. And when was the last time that happened?
Would you believe it was July of 2021? Over 3 years, somewhere in the state has been in D2 or worse category. So again, November changed everything for us and puts us on a good trajectory to hopefully maintain this adequate moisture.
And our last factor of weather to think about in 2024, severe weather, and when we think of Kansas and severe weather, tornadoes.
That's true. On average, the state of Kansas has 85 tornadoes a year. That's based on data from the Storm Prediction Center for the last 25 years. Surprisingly, it was that we had 89 tornadoes. That's the current preliminary count from the Storm Prediction Center. They do a lot of surveys and things, and there'll be a final number released much later in 2025. But of those 89 tornadoes, there was only one that was EF2 or worse. It was an EF3 that hit the town of Westmoreland, that's in Pottawatomie County, on April 30th. And unfortunately, there was one fatality associated with that tornado. And that ended up being the only fatality in the state this year. So we're glad, of course. I mean, it's obviously terrible that there was a fatality, but normally we would expect a few fatalities from much stronger tornadoes. We just didn't have it. We had a lot of weak tornadoes this year, which was good news because that did limit the damage and the loss of property and life as well.
Matt, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us a recap of weather in 2024.
Okay, well, for 2024, the news is warmer than normal and close to normal precipitation. We've made some recovery. We'll see. We've got a couple more weeks to see how the year ends.
That was Assistant State Climatologist with K-State, Matt Sittel. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show talking about wildlife and avian influenza with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby.
Drew, right now, as we think about wildlife, specifically birds and avian influenza, what's the concern?
Well, avian influenza, the name, of course, implies that it's a disease that birds are going to have. And right now, we're actually seeing a pretty big uptick in the incidence of avian influenza in Kansas, and more specifically, the H5N1, which they call a highly pathogenic avian influenza. And it's called that because it's very, very lethal to poultry. And it's not as lethal to all species of birds. All birds are susceptible, but I kind of went on a tangent there. But the reason that we're seeing an uptick in it in Kansas right now is because of the migration of waterfowl that's going on. Ducks, geese are both very good reservoirs for highly pathogenic avian influenza, and when they're migrating, we see a couple of different things happen. One is that we see big congregations of those birds, lots of feces being deposited and saliva maybe exchanging, and then the sick birds that have mucous membranes that are shedding that virus. All that stuff comes together to lead to lots of transmission. We're seeing birds die at reservoirs, sometimes in pretty high numbers, and so folks are noticing that, and it's definitely something that we need to be aware of.
Do people need to do anything with birds that they see are sick and or dying?
No. The best thing that you can do if you do find a dead goose or a dead duck or really any dead bird right now is just leave it alone. Or if you find a dying bird, please don't collect that and take it to a wildlife rehabilitator or something like that. Most of these species that are being affected, there's plenty of them. They're abundant species, and we don't need to try and save them. And transporting one of those sick animals has a much higher risk of spreading the disease around or potentially infecting a rehabilitation center, and that's sure something we don't want to do.
If there is a dead one and they have to move it, what precautions should they take?
The main recommendation there is that we wear disposable, impermeable gloves of some kind, so exam gloves like latex or nitrile. If you don't have access to that kind of stuff, some dishwashing gloves that you can throw away after you handle the bird. It can be transmitted through aerosolized feces or saliva, so the recommendation is that you wear a mask, like an N95 mask. So gloves, mask, double bag the bird, put it in the household trash. Don't bring it in the house, but put it in the trash can outside of the house, put it in a dumpster, that sort of thing, so it can go to a landfill.
Besides duck and geese, what else can it impact?
This can infect any species of bird. So the main species that we see it in are critters like shorebirds that are going to hang out in the same places as the ducks and geese. We can also see it in raptors like eagles, hawks, owls, scavenging birds like crows. It tends not to be a super common disease among songbirds, which are the main birds that folks are targeting with bird feeders, but some of the birds that we do see at bird feeders a lot, like pigeons, doves, and starlings and house sparrows, are starting to show up as being a common bird that's infected in this when we look at the recent data. So those bird feeders could definitely be a hotspot for disease transmission, so that's something to consider.
Maybe get rid of the bird feeder then?
Well, there's no official recommendation about that. There are lots of complications with bird feeders, and one of them is that they can always be a hotspot for disease transmission. So really, anytime that's something that folks should be aware of, the recommendations are that those be disinfected frequently. We're talking about, every 24 hours to at least once a week, disinfecting them with like a 10% bleach solution. That's going to have a pretty strong after smell that the birds might be averse to. So other options would be isopropyl alcohol, which might evaporate and leave less of a smell behind. Hydrogen peroxide is also an effective disinfectant against avian influenza too.
Any special precautions for someone who has a backyard flock?
Absolutely. If we've got a backyard flock of poultry, we should not have a bird feeder out there right now, because you definitely run the risk of infecting that backyard flock of poultry by attracting wild birds while we've got this high-path avian influenza going around.
Drew, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.